The day my daughter introduced me to the man she wanted to marry, I knew something felt off. I couldn't name it then. You know that feeling, the kind that sits quiet in your chest, not loud enough to call it a warning, but heavy enough that you notice it. I told myself I was being overprotective. That's what fathers do, I thought. We see danger in every man who looks at our daughters the way we used to look at someone else's. His name was Brandon. He came from Oakville, the kind of neighborhood where the driveways are wider than my whole front yard in Sudbury. He shook my hand that first night with 2 fingers, too many rings, and not enough grip. My daughter, Claire, stood beside him, with that look she'd been wearing since she turned 30, hopeful and slightly braced, like she was waiting for me to say something wrong. I didn't. I made coffee. I asked him what he did. He said finance. I nodded like that explained everything. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years working for the city of Sudbury Water and Waste Management, if you want the formal title. Before that, 2 years of college, 1 year of trying to make a go of it in Toronto, and then back north, because that's where I made sense. I drove a second-hand Silverado until it gave out on me on Highway 69, and then I bought another one, also second-hand. I own my house outright. That took 24 years. I'm telling you this not because I think it makes me special. I'm telling you because of what happened later. Claire and I had always been close, or I believed we had. Her mother, my wife Patricia, passed when Claire was 19. Ovarian cancer. Very fast once they found it. The 2 of us navigated that grief together the best we could, which mostly meant not talking about it directly and being careful with each other in small ways. I made sure I was home for dinner. She called every Sunday. We managed. When she met Brandon, she was 31 and she wanted to be settled. I understood that. He was 34, worked at an investment firm downtown Toronto, made the kind of money that makes people assume things about you. He drove a car that cost more than my first house. I noticed all of this without judgment, or at least I tried to. Patricia would have said I was already judging. She knew me better than I knew myself. The engagement happened fast. 14 months after they met, Brandon proposed at some restaurant in Yorkville with a ring that Claire showed me on FaceTime, her face bright and a little overwhelmed. I said I was happy for her. I meant it. I said I looked forward to getting to know him better. I meant that too. What I did not expect was the dinner in February. They drove up to Sudbury, a 5-hour drive, which I always appreciated even when I pretended it was nothing, and they brought Brandon's parents with them. His father, Clifford, had made his money in commercial real estate. His mother, Paulette, was the kind of woman who touches things in other people's homes while making conversation, as if she's pricing them. They sat around my kitchen table, the same table where Claire had done her homework for 12 years, and I watched them take in my house the way people look at something they've already decided is less than they expected. I had made a full dinner: roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans, a bottle of Niagara Red I'd been saving. I'm not a restaurant cook, but I'm a decent one. Patricia taught me. I set the table properly, the way she would have wanted. Clifford talked about a property development in Mississauga for most of dinner. Paulette asked Claire twice whether they considered buying in Oakville rather than renting in Leslieville. Brandon mostly agreed with whatever his parents said and occasionally looked at Claire in a way that I can only describe as performative, like he was playing the role of good son in front of witnesses. I asked Brandon about the wedding plans. He shrugged and said Claire was handling most of it, which seemed to satisfy him as an answer. After dessert, I had made a butter tart square that my mother used to make, a recipe from her side, Northern Ontario, real lard pastry. Paulette looked around the kitchen once more and said, bright as anything, "It's cozy in here, very lived in." I let that pass. The trouble started when Claire mentioned, in the course of conversation, that I used to coach her hockey team when she was 12. Just a small thing, a memory. She smiled when she said it. Brandon laughed. Not meanly, at first. It was that social laugh, the kind that fills silence. Then he said, "I keep forgetting your dad is more of a small-town guy." He glanced at his father when he said it. Clifford smiled into his wine glass. I looked at my daughter. She looked at her plate. "Blue collar all the way," Brandon added, like he was completing a thought. "Nothing wrong with it. Somebody has to keep the pipes running, right?" He winked at me when he said that. Actually winked. I said nothing. I took a sip of my wine. Paulette started talking about something else. A renovation, I think. Something about reclaimed hardwood. I sat there at my own table, at Patricia's table, in the house I had paid for entirely on my own, and I was very still. I have been still like that before. Not often, but I know that feeling. I recognized something in that moment. It wasn't just the comment, it was Claire. She had heard what he said, and she had chosen not to meet my eyes. That was the part that lived in me for weeks afterward. In the months leading up to the wedding, I saw Brandon perhaps 4 more times. He was never openly rude again. He was something worse, consistently dismissive in that easy way that some people have, where they make you feel faintly irrelevant and then act surprised if you mention it. He called me the old man twice in conversations I was present for, speaking to Claire as though I weren't standing 6 feet away. Claire laughed both times. Small laughs, apologetic ones, but she laughed. I drove back from Toronto after the second visit, feeling something I didn't want to name. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something closer to grief, the kind you feel when you realize someone you love has decided that your opinion of them matters less than someone else's. I called my old friend Len that night. Len and I have known each other since we were 19. He's retired now too, used to work up at the Falcon Bridge mine. I told him the basics without dramatizing. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Well, you'll know when the time comes." That's Len. Never wastes a word. The wedding was in September, a Saturday, out at a vineyard near Niagara-on-the-Lake. Beautiful property, I'll say that honestly. 220 guests, a string quartet, a catering company that had a name on the menu cards. It was the kind of wedding where everything is selected and nothing is accidental. I wore the suit I had bought for Patricia's sister's funeral, which was the last formal occasion I'd had reason to dress for. It was a good suit, charcoal gray, well made, just not new. I arrived early because that's my habit. A young man from the venue's staff directed me to a seat. 3rd row from the back, far left side, behind a column that partially blocked the sightline to the altar. I assumed it was a mistake. I found the wedding coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and an earpiece, and mentioned that I was the father of the bride. She checked her clipboard. She apologized with her mouth, but not her eyes. She said there'd been a seating adjustment and that the families had approved the plan. Then she moved on before I could respond. I sat in the 3rd row from the back. My daughter walked down the aisle 20 minutes later on the arm of her Uncle Dennis, Patricia's brother, who'd been asked to do the honor. I had not been told about that decision. I had assumed, without ever asking, that I would be the one to walk beside her. That was my first mistake, assuming she still needed that from me the way she once would have. I watched her walk. She looked beautiful. She was nervous in the way she used to get before a math exam. Jaw set, eyes forward, moving through it. I thought about the morning of Patricia's funeral, when Claire had sat on the edge of the bathtub in her black dress, and I'd stood in the doorway, and neither of us had been able to say anything useful, but we'd both stayed there for a while anyway. I thought about that for some reason. The ceremony was fine. The officiant was good. Brandon cried a little at the vows, which the crowd responded to warmly. I clapped at the right times. At the reception, I was seated at a table near the back with some of Claire's university friends, people I'd met once or twice over the years and liked well enough, but didn't know deeply. The head table was up front, Brandon's family, 2 of his close friends, his best man. Claire sat there among them, glancing back at me once early in the evening. I smiled at her. She looked away quickly. Brandon's father gave a toast. It was long and mostly about Brandon, his achievements, his drive, the pride of watching him build something real. He mentioned Claire warmly but briefly, the way you might mention a good hire. He made a joke about his son finally settling down that got a big laugh. There was no mention of Patricia. There was no mention of me. I had been told earlier in the week that I would give a toast. I had written one. I had read it to Len on the phone and he'd said it was good. I waited through dinner. The evening moved along. The MC announced the father of the groom, then the maid of honor, then the best man. The dancing started. Nobody called me up. I sat with my glass and I watched my daughter on the dance floor with her new husband, and something in my chest settled into a new configuration. Not breaking, just reorganizing. Around 9 o'clock, Brandon came over to my table. It was the first time he'd spoken to me all evening. He looked loose from the champagne, happy in that way that makes some people careless. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, loudly enough that 3 other people at my table heard it clearly, "Hey, good of you to make the trip down from up north. Claire said you don't get out to the city much. Must be a bit much for you, hey?" All this, he gestured at the room, the flowers, the lights, the whole production of the evening. He was smiling when he said it. That's the thing people don't always understand about humiliation. It's rarely shouted. It comes in quiet, wearing a smile, banking on the assumption that you'll absorb it without reaction because making a scene would embarrass everyone. I looked at his hand on my shoulder. I looked at his face. I thought about Patricia's chair at my kitchen table, which I still can't bring myself to move. I thought about 31 years of 6 a.m. starts and every cracked water main in a Sudbury winter, and the fact that I had paid for this wedding, or a significant portion of it, without Brandon or his family ever asking or apparently wondering how. I said, "Actually, I have something I'd like to say while everyone's still here, if that's all right." His expression flickered. Just for a second. Then he shrugged and said, "Sure, old man, go ahead." I found the MC. He was a friend of Brandon's, good-natured about it, handed me the microphone without much fuss. I waited for the room to quiet. It took a moment. Then it did. I said, "I'm Lawrence, Claire's father. Some of you know me, most of you probably don't." I paused. I was supposed to give a toast earlier in the evening, but the timeline got away from us, so I appreciate the moment now. A few people laughed. Claire was watching me from the head table with her hands flat on the tablecloth. I said, "Patricia, Claire's mother, passed 14 years ago. She would have been here tonight. She would have cried at the ceremony and pretended she wasn't, and she would have danced, which she was terrible at but committed to fully." Some people laughed again, warmer this time. I saw Claire's face change slightly. I raised Claire mostly alone after that. We figured it out as we went. She turned out better than I had any right to expect. I let that sit for a second. Then I said, "I want to say something to Brandon and his family, and I want to say it plainly because that's the only way I know how." The room was very quiet now. "I know how tonight has gone," I said. "I know where I was seated. I know there was a toast that didn't happen. I know that some of you see a man from a small northern Ontario city in a suit that isn't this year's, and you've made certain calculations. I wasn't angry when I said this. I want you to understand that." My voice was steady. "And that's fine. People make those calculations. I've made peace with that over the years." I looked at Brandon directly. He was very still. "What I want Brandon's family to know," I said, "is some things that didn't come up in conversation. The RRSP I've been building since 1987, that I liquidated a portion of to contribute to this wedding without being asked or thanked. The education fund I opened for Claire when she was 4 months old, which paid for 3 years of university at Laurentian and then 2 more at Ryerson, debt-free. Because I decided when Patricia got sick that Claire would never have to start her adult life carrying someone else's financial mistakes. I paused. The mortgage on the house Claire and Brandon just signed in Leslieville. The down payment. That was me. I heard something shift in the room, a murmur somewhere. I'm not saying this for gratitude, I continued. I genuinely don't need it. I'm saying it because a man was pointed at tonight as someone who doesn't belong in this room, and I want that man's daughter to know, in front of everyone she's choosing to build her life around, exactly who her father is. I set the microphone down on the table beside me. I didn't wait for applause. I went back to my seat, picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, and walked to the bar to get a glass of water. Clifford found me 10 minutes later. His face had done something complicated. He started to speak, and I said gently, "Not tonight. We can talk another time if you'd like, but not tonight." He nodded. He walked away. What I didn't expect, what I had truly not permitted myself to expect, was Claire. She came to me just before 11. The dancing had started up again. She walked across the room in her dress, and she sat down in the empty chair beside me without saying anything for a moment. I looked at her. She looked like she was working something out. She said, "Dad." I said, "It's okay." She said, "No, it isn't." Her voice cracked on the last word. I should have said something. All of it. The seating, the toast. I knew, and I let it happen because I didn't want to fight, and I thought... She stopped. "I thought you'd understand without me having to explain." I said, "I did understand." She said, "That's not the same as it being okay." We sat there for a minute. The music was something loud and cheerful behind us. I said, "Your mother would have liked this vineyard." Claire laughed despite herself, the way she always does when I bring Patricia in sideways like that. She would have tried every single wine on the menu. She would have made friends with the sommelier. She absolutely would have. Claire was quiet again. Then she put her hand over mine on the table, just rested it there, the way she used to when she was small and wanted me to know she was nearby. "I'm sorry, Dad." I turned my hand over and held hers. "I'm not going to tell you the rest of that night was easy, because it wasn't. Brandon apologized to me, briefly, in the parking lot near midnight, and it was the kind of apology that a man gives when he has been caught rather than when he is sorry, but it was something. His parents left without speaking to me again. I drove back to my hotel in Niagara Falls and sat in the parking lot for a while before I went in. What I keep coming back to is not the speech. I've told this story to a few people now, and they always want to talk about the speech, what I said, how I said it, whether it was the right thing to do. That's fair. I've asked myself the same question, but what I keep coming back to is Claire's hand on mine, the weight of it, the fact that she came across the room. I have a photograph from that night that a guest sent me afterward. It's the two of us sitting at that table near the back, her in the dress, me in the charcoal suit. We're both looking somewhere off to the left, and you can't see our faces clearly, but you can see her hand in mine. I put it in the same frame as a photo of Patricia and me at Claire's first birthday. They sit on my mantel now, side by side. Two pictures of the people I loved most at moments when it mattered. I think that's enough. For most things in life, I think that turns out to be enough. I keep thinking about that photograph. The two of us at the back table, Claire's hand resting in mine. You can't see our faces clearly, and somehow that makes it more honest than any posed wedding portrait ever could be. I didn't take that microphone to win anything. I want to be clear about that, because people hear this story and they think it was a performance, a man settling a score in front of 200 people. But that's not what it felt like from the inside. What it felt like was 31 years of quiet decisions finally needing to be said out loud. Not for Brandon, not for Clifford or Paulette, for Claire, and maybe, if I'm being fully honest, for Patricia, who never got to be in that room. The thing about living with integrity, and I don't use that word lightly, it's one of those words that gets worn smooth from overuse, is that it doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. You make the RRSP contribution in February when you'd rather fix the truck. You open the education fund when your daughter is 4 months old and you're still numb from losing your wife. You write the check for the down payment without mentioning it over dinner. None of those moments feel significant at the time. They feel like what you're supposed to do, what a father does, what a decent person does. And then one evening, someone in a good suit makes a joke about the pipes running, and you realize that all those quiet years built something they couldn't see, and you never bothered to explain. I think that's what people miss about decency. It doesn't protect you from being underestimated. It protects you from being undone by it. What I had that night, standing up with that microphone, was clarity, not anger. I've met men who speak from anger, and it shows, the way a cracked foundation shows eventually. What I had was something steadier. I knew what was true. I knew what I had done and why I had done it, and I knew it calmly, the way you know a road you've driven for 30 years. That kind of knowing doesn't rattle. It just waits. Len called me the following Tuesday. He asked how it went. I gave him the short version. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You did right." That was it. 4 words. From Len. That's a standing ovation. What I hope, and I say hope because I'm 63 and I've learned to be careful with certainty, is that Claire carries something forward from that night. Not the speech. The other part, the part where she walked across the room in her wedding dress and sat down and said the words she should have said months earlier. That took something real. It takes a particular kind of courage to correct yourself in the middle of the happiest night of your life. I was proud of her for it. I didn't say so in the moment because I didn't need to. But I was. The life I built was never going to look impressive from the outside, and I made my peace with that a long time ago. Small city, city job, second-hand trucks, a kitchen table that's older than my daughter. But it was built right. And when the moment came that required it to hold, it held. That's the only standard that ever mattered to me, and it's the one I'd pass on to anyone willing to listen. Build something true. Have the patience to let it speak for itself, and when it finally does, you won't need to raise your voice.